In a world where fame and darkness collide, Rachel Kennedy, a former exotic dancer and model, shares a shocking revelation. She claims she was lured into a party hosted by none other than Sean Diddy Combs, the once revered music mogul now imprisoned on serious racketeering and sex trafficking charges. As Rachel reflects on her time with him, she uncovers hidden truths that challenge everything she thought she knew. Get ready to dive deep into this chilling story. Welcome to Dark Truths.
Hey everyone, welcome back. This time we're going deep on something really fascinating and kind of dark.
Yep, buckle up.
Yeah, this is an episode of the podcast, Dark Truths, and it's the one all about the accusations against Sean Diddy Combs.
It's a wild one for sure.
So just to catch everybody up, Combs is facing some serious charges, right? Sex trafficking, racketeering, conspiracy transportation for prostitution.
Yeah, it stems from these accusations of basically coerced sexual acts and drug use during these events that they called freak-offs.
Yeah.
So it's a whole thing.
Now, what makes this particular episode of this podcast interesting is they interview Rachel Kennedy, who's a former Playboy model.
Yeah.
And she had an encounter with Combs back in 2000.
Right.
And she claims that her experience was consensual.
Yeah, so it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah, how does this fit in with all these other accusations? So
It's really interesting because it provides this alternate perspective that could actually be really key for the defense, especially when it comes to trying to understand what exactly these freak-offs were all about.
yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right? What exactly went down at these things?
Were they all coercive, or is there another side to the story? And that's kind of where Kennedy's account comes into play.
Okay, so let's paint a picture for our listeners here.
Sure.
So what exactly happened with Kennedy and Combs?
Okay, so picture this. It's Tokyo 2000. Kennedy is working as a dancer. She meets Combs at a gentleman's club.
Oh, wow.
He invites her and some friends back to his hotel for what he says is going to be a party.
Okay.
But when they get there,
It's not a party?
it is not a party. It is just Combs
Oh,
in a bathrobe
oh my
with a
God.
bottle of champagne and a Jennifer Lopez music video playing on repeat.
Wait, hold on, Jennifer Lopez?
Yeah, they were dating at the time.
Wow.
And get this, he's actually on the phone with J-Lo while this is all happening.
Okay, that's strange.
It's a very strange scene.
Okay, so where does the consensual part come in?
So according to Kennedy, Combs was really adamant about not doing hard drugs, only weed. And he even snuck off to the bathroom to do cocaine because he said he didn't want it around him.
This is interesting considering he's facing drug distribution charges, right?
Yeah, it directly contradicts that narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So now here's where things get even more complicated. Kennedy and a friend end up performing sex acts on Combs.
Oh,
But she insists that it was all consensual, fueled by the champagne.
okay. But then more. This is already a lot.
Yeah, Combs' bodyguard bursts in. He's furious. Apparently, he'd had his eye on one of the women from the night before and was not happy about the situation, and he kicks the women out.
Oh, wow.
Combs doesn't stop him.
Talk about a power move.
Yeah.
So what did Kennedy have to say about all of this, like looking back on it?
So years later, knowing what we know now about all the accusations against Combs, Kennedy looks back and says, knowing now what I know now, I think we were more than lucky.
That's kind of chilling, like almost a what if.
Exactly, like what if things had gone differently?
Yeah. She calls Combs a puppet master and worries about other women who might not have been as lucky.
So it does make you wonder, is she maybe downplaying what happened, or is there just something about Combs' behavior that we're not quite understanding yet?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah, so we've got someone claiming consent, but then we have these accusations painting a very different picture. So
Right.
what's the takeaway here?
Well, I think what Kennedy's story does is add this layer of complexity to the entire case, right? We can't just look at it in black and white.
Right.
It brings up these really important questions about consent, particularly when you factor in the power dynamics at play.
Absolutely. Because even if something starts out consensual, can that consent really be maintained when someone like Combs is involved? I mean, is it truly free and uninfluenced?
Right. You have to wonder about
And then that makes you think, okay, how is the legal system going to sort all of this out?
Yeah.
It's going to be tough.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, so let's try to do that.
Okay.
Let's unpack it a little bit more.
First, let's talk about Kennedy's credibility. I mean, how reliable is her account? Does she seem trustworthy in the podcast?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And ultimately, it's up to a jury to decide. But just based on the interview, she does come across as sincere. I mean, she
Yeah.
remembers very specific details, and there's this unease about the whole situation that seems pretty genuine.
Okay, so for the sake of argument, let's say that she is telling the truth.
Okay.
How does that square with the other accusations that are alleging coercion?
That's where it gets tricky because her experience seems so different from what others are describing.
Right.
More forceful, more exploitative. And that difference is something that the defense could definitely use to their advantage. They could argue that, yeah, maybe Combs has some unconventional preferences,
Right.
but that doesn't automatically make him a criminal.
So they're not denying the encounters, they're just denying the criminal aspect.
Exactly. They're trying to paint this picture of consent, even if it's a bit, morally gray.
Okay, so then how does the bodyguard's outburst fit into all this? I mean, that doesn't sound very consensual.
That's a great point. It's definitely something that the defense would need to address. They might try to distance Combs from the bodyguard's actions, say he wasn't involved, didn't condone it,
Yeah.
maybe even reprimanded him later.
Right, basically saying it was an isolated incident, not part of a pattern.
Exactly. They'd want to keep the focus on Kennedy's story, the one that supports their narrative.
Right, okay, I see. So we've got these two competing narratives emerging.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that this case is about specific legal charges.
Yeah.
So how does Kennedy's account and the defense's potential strategy actually impact those charges?
Right. Well, that's where it gets really interesting when we get into the legal specifics.
Oh.
Let's take the sex trafficking charge, for example, to prove that the prosecution has to demonstrate that Combs used force, fraud, or coercion to compel someone into commercial sex acts.
Right.
Kennedy's story directly challenges that because she wasn't a sex worker. She claims she willingly participated and there was no exchange of money.
So her account could completely undermine that charge.
The defense could argue that if even one of the alleged victims is claiming consent, it throws doubt on the whole prosecution's case.
Makes sense. What about the racketeering charge, though? I mean, that seems harder to shake.
It's definitely more complex because for racketeering, they need to prove that Combs was leading or participating in an organized criminal enterprise.
Right.
Now, Kennedy's account doesn't directly contradict that, but it doesn't really support it either.
Unless they can link it to this larger pattern.
Right. They would need to connect the dots, show that Kennedy's encounter, however consensual she says it was somehow facilitated or influenced by this alleged criminal enterprise. And that's maybe where the bodyguard's actions could come into play.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
If they can show that Combs orchestrated it or condoned those intimidation tactics, it could strengthen that racketeering case.
Right, because it shows a pattern.
Exactly. So it really comes down to the evidence and how it's presented, right?
Right.
The prosecution needs to create a compelling narrative that ties Kennedy's experience to this larger criminal scheme. The defense, on the other hand, is going to try to poke holes in that narrative, emphasize those claims of consent, and portray Combs as just someone with unusual preferences, not this criminal mastermind.
It's a high-stakes legal battle, for sure, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other.
Absolutely. And this is just one piece of the puzzle. Remember, we also have this whole question of how the court will define a freak-off.
Oh, that's right, because will they accept a broad interpretation that includes all of these incidents, or will they take a narrower approach that potentially excludes Kennedy's experience?
Exactly. That definition could really make or break the prosecution's case.
Wow, so we've got Kennedy's account, bodyguard's actions, this whole ambiguity surrounding the definition of freak-offs.
It's like this web.
Yeah, it feels like this case is more about interpretation than just straightforward facts.
I think you're right, and that's what makes it so fascinating, because it's not just about what happened, but how those events are perceived, both within the legal system and by public opinion.
Like we're watching a legal thriller unfold, but in real time.
Yeah, and the stakes are incredibly high.
It's a lot to process, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
We've just started to dive in.
Yeah, but before we go any deeper into potential legal strategies and the ramifications of all of this, let's take a quick breather.
Okay.
And when we come back, we'll explore the strategic implications for both sides. Will Kennedy be called as a witness? Will the defense use her account to build a narrative of consensual encounters? All that, and more so. Stay tuned.
Welcome back.
All right, so we've been talking about this Rachel Kennedy and her encounter with Sean Combs.
Right.
And it seems like her story has really thrown a wrench into things.
It's definitely added a layer of complexity.
So let's dive into the legal strategies here a bit more, starting with the prosecution.
Okay.
What are they up against with this whole Kennedy situation?
Well, their goal is to prove this pattern of criminal behavior, right, coercion, exploitation, maybe even an organized effort with these freak-offs. And Kennedy's claim that her experience was consensual really throws a wrench into that.
So do they try to discredit her then? Make her seem unreliable?
They could, but it's a risky move because what if they can't actually shake her credibility?
Right, it could backfire.
Exactly. It could make her seem even more sympathetic to the jury.
What about just avoiding her altogether, not calling her as a witness?
It's possible, but then it kind of leaves this gap in their narrative.
Right.
And the defense could easily seize on that. You know, they'd say, look, even this woman who spent time with Combs says it wasn't like what the prosecution is claiming.
So ignoring her could be just as damaging as confronting her.
It's a tough call for the prosecution. They've got to weigh the potential damage either way.
Okay, so let's flip the script then. What about the defense? How might they use Kennedy's story to their advantage?
Well, they could present her as a key witness, right? Someone who directly contradicts that whole narrative of coercion and abuse. They'd emphasize her credibility, the fact that she remembers things so clearly and that she willingly participated.
So basically saying her experience is representative of how Combs typically interacts with women.
Exactly. Consensual, even if a bit unconventional. They'd say, look, Kennedy wasn't forced, she wasn't drugged, she's not claiming any wrongdoing. This whole thing is a witch hunt based on assumptions and rumors.
That's a powerful argument, especially if they can back it up with other witnesses who had similar experiences.
Right. It builds this picture of Combs as someone who maybe has unusual preferences but isn't actually a criminal.
But what about the bodyguard bursting in? How do they explain that away?
That's the tricky part. They might try to distance Combs from the bodyguard's actions, saying he wasn't involved, he didn't condone it, maybe even reprimanded him later.
So an isolated incident.
Right, not part of a larger pattern of intimidation or control.
Okay, so we've got these two competing narratives. But we have to remember, this case hinges on specific legal charges.
Right.
So how does Kennedy's account and the defense's strategy actually impact those charges?
Well, that's where things get really interesting when we look at the legal specifics. Take the sex trafficking charge, for instance.
Okay.
For that to stick, the prosecution has to prove that Combs used force, fraud, or coercion to compel someone into commercial sex acts, and Kennedy's story directly challenges that.
Because she wasn't a sex worker, she said she willingly participated.
Exactly, and there was no exchange of money, so her account could potentially undermine that whole charge.
So what about the racketeering charge? That seems a lot harder to just dismiss.
It's definitely more complex because they have to prove he was leading or participating in this organized criminal enterprise. And Kennedy's account, well, doesn't directly contradict that, but it doesn't really support it either.
Unless they can link her experience to a larger pattern.
Right, they would need to show that Kennedy's encounter, even if it was consensual, was somehow facilitated by this larger criminal enterprise. And that's where the bodyguard's actions could come into play.
Right, because if they could prove Combs orchestrated or condoned those intimidation tactics, then it strengthens the racketeering case.
Exactly. It comes down to the evidence and how it's presented. The prosecution has to weave this compelling narrative that links Kennedy to this larger criminal scheme, and the defense is going to try to poke holes in that narrative, emphasize consent, and just portray Combs as a guy with, unusual preferences, not a criminal mastermind.
It's a real battle of narratives then.
Absolutely. And remember, we've got this other piece of the puzzle too, how the court will actually define freak off.
Oh, right.
Huh?
Will they accept a broad interpretation that includes all of these incidents, or will they narrow it down and maybe exclude Kennedy's experience?
And that definition could be crucial because if they can't clearly define freak off and prove all the incidents fit that definition, then the whole case could unravel.
Wow, so we've got Kennedy's account, the bodyguard's actions, the ambiguity of freak-offs. It seems like there's more focus on interpretation than just straightforward facts in this case.
I think you're right, and that's what makes it so interesting. We're not just looking at what happened, but how those events are being perceived both by the legal system and public opinion.
It really feels like we're watching this legal chess match unfold in real time.
And the stakes are so high. Combs' reputation, his freedom, the impact this could have on similar accusations in the future, it's a lot.
It is a lot, and we haven't even touched on the broader societal implications of all of this yet.
Right, we need to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, so let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll do just that. We'll explore what this whole case means for the entertainment industry and beyond. Stay with us.
All right, so we're back and ready to kind of zoom out a little bit, look at the bigger picture here.
Yeah, it's important to remember that this Sean Combs situation, it's not just a courtroom drama. It really feels like it's tapping into something much larger. It does. So let's talk about that. What are we seeing shift in the entertainment industry?
Well, think about the hashtag #MeToo movement and everything that's come after that. There's a greater awareness now of how power can be abused, how consent can be manipulated, and the lasting impact of these kinds of experiences.
So are you saying that what might have been considered normal behavior in the past is now being seen in a whole new light?
Absolutely. The rules are changing. The lines are blurring. What might have been brushed aside or even celebrated in the past is now being scrutinized way more critically.
So how does this Combs case fit into all of that?
It's like a test case, accusations against him, the defense's strategies, how the public is reacting. It's all playing out against this backdrop of changing norms and this increased awareness of power dynamics.
It makes you wonder if this case could set a precedent for how these kinds of situations are handled in the future.
It could have a ripple effect throughout the industry, maybe encourage more people to come forward or make institutions take these accusations a lot more seriously.
But it's not just about these high-profile cases. Is it this conversation about consent and accountability? It's happening everywhere.
And that's the key takeaway here. This case is just a microcosm of a much larger societal shift. We're redefining what's acceptable, and it's not just in Hollywood, it's in workplaces, schools, even personal relationships.
It's about understanding that consent is ongoing. It's not just a one-time thing, and that power imbalances can really affect consent.
Exactly, and that accountability is crucial.
It feels like an evolving conversation, right? We're still figuring it out as a society.
Absolutely. There will always be nuances and gray areas, but the more we talk about it, the better equipped we'll be to navigate these complex situations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the biggest question I have is, what does all of this mean for the future?
That's the million-dollar question, but I think the answer is that we need to keep having this conversation, keep pushing the boundaries, demanding accountability, and really advocating for a culture where consent is truly respected and power is used responsibly.
It's about creating a world where stories like Kennedy's, whether they involve alleged crimes or just morally questionable behavior, are taken seriously and actually lead to meaningful change.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has certainly given us all a lot to think about. Thanks for joining me on this journey. And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.